All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, Coach J.K. McLeod, and today, on today's fitness and nutrition focused episode, as we typically do most Tuesdays here, I'm going to talk to you about the topic of losing muscle at the age of 40. Is this a myth or is it true? So before getting into today's episode, I, as always, first want to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. It's important to me to take at least 1 minute to express gratitude. I know that you have plenty of other podcast content that you could be consuming right now. So I just appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to press play on Help Me Understand and include it in hopefully your weekly podcast queue. If you're not already subscribed to or following the Help Me Understand podcast, I would sincerely appreciate it if you did subscribe, follow, like, whatever works on whatever platform that you're on right now. And if you feel so motivated to do or inclined to do, pass this episode on to a friend, a family member, a coworker, maybe even somebody that you just don't like, but you think they could possibly benefit from the information that I am about to share and the perspective that I'm about to bring. So with that, let's get into today's topic. And as I teased at the very beginning, I want to address a common belief that's out there in a narrative that you start to lose or you lose your muscle starting at age 40, and then it's pretty much just all downhill from there. And what might surprise you is that I am not going to say that that is a complete and total lie or that it's a complete myth, because it's not. What I will say, though, is that there is this like sliver of information or sliver of, at one point, what was fact that was proven, or at least a conclusion drawn. And then, as with most things these days, I find in the fitness marketing realm, we took that and then just completely ran with it. And then we have like repackaged it, remixed it, repurposed it, and utilized it to try and drive a particular narrative in the fitness marketing world. So let's go ahead and jump on into things. So from my point of view, I think that there's this belief out there that you hit 40 and then suddenly people want to act like your muscles got the memo to like start packing their bags, and it's all downhill from there. And I posted about this recently on Threads or Instagram, where I just shared this thought that I had, or this reminder that folks have really got to chill with this whole, like, as soon as anything becomes somewhat physically uncomfortable, as soon as there's any sort of an ache or a pain or a tweak, or maybe you're moving a little bit slowly, you recover a little bit slower than usual, when you are 40 plus tax, I'm going to call it. And I say this from the perspective of somebody who's 47, just recently turned 47. You gotta, like, we have got to chill with all of that, because that is not everybody's story. It may be your story. It may be somebody that you know's story, but that is not everybody's story. And I certainly am not going to pretend that I know the person that's listening on the other side of this microphone or whatever we've got going on, or watching on the other side of this screen. I won't pretend to know your life or anything like that. What I will say, though, is I'm a strong believer in the idea that words matter, and the words that you speak to others and you speak to yourself matter. Those things are enforcing some sort of a belief, like they're doubling down on a belief, because there's the thought, then there's the words, and then there's the action that follows that. And I'm just a strong proponent of, in this particular category, the whole like, yeah, guess this is just what happens when you turn 40. As I had posted on Threads, like, miss me with that whole thing, because that's not something that I'm willing to put a whole lot of energy into manifesting and making that particular thing happen. So why don't I get off my soapbox and let's kind of dig into it. So first, let's actually define the concept of muscle loss. And muscle loss is essentially kind of encapsulated within the term sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is the age-related loss of muscle mass and strength. So I do want to clarify, like, small changes are very normal throughout your entire life. Big declines, though, in things like muscle mass are typically going to be more dependent on your lifestyle, not just your birthday. So, for example, my birthday was August 30th of this year when I turned 47. It's not like all of a sudden on August 30th, because I turned 47, then a light switch was flipped or I just went down another notch in the muscle mass pyramid or whatever we want to call it. Like I didn't just go down the ladder or down the step. And I say this from the perspective of working with a number of clients who, for the most part, the majority of my client base since I started training 10 years ago and still now tend to be 40 plus, just overall by the nature of the folks that tend to work with me. So I speak from that experience. Also, try to stay pretty dialed in with recent research, and I'm actually going to talk a bit about that. But first, let me share with you where I think that some of this, like at 40, you start to fall off of a cliff thought process kind of came from. So from an origin story standpoint, there was some early research that relied on what we call like cross-sectional studies where they compared younger and older adults, but not necessarily like long-term data where they actually followed the same people. And there was one study that's cited or used to be cited pretty often that was back in 1988. And I will do my best to try and put links to this stuff in the show notes. But it was a study in the Journal of Neurological Sciences back in 1988. And what they did back then was they autopsied leg muscle samples from men that were aged anywhere from like 15 to 83. And what they found was a 40% reduction in muscle fibers by age 80, with changes visible as early as age 40. So while that study was groundbreaking, like for that particular time, later on, as research improved, we start to understand some of the limitations of that particular study that was done back in 1988. Small sample size, all right. 2, all males. So there's a piece there. And then 3, you have the tissue that was studied. It was all from cadavers. So we're not even talking like live people. And most importantly, and this is the explicit bias that I have, is there was no insight into the participants is kind of a weird term to use when it comes to cadavers. The specimens, I guess. No insight into their lifestyle, no insight to what their training history was. So what happens is from that particular piece of information, people run with that and start touting this, well, that whole thing, like it starts at 40. But more of like the modern, like longitudinal research, it paints a much slower and more nuanced picture. So understand that a lot of times when you are seeing, or when back in, I was going to say back in my day. So I'd say back in like the mid to late 90s, then going into the early 2000s, a lot of these things that were being referenced in magazines and newspapers, because it still wasn't, smartphone wasn't like the massive thing. Those things, you take one thing and then one person runs with it, then another person runs with it, and then all of a sudden it basically becomes gospel until we have better evidence that comes along. And that's where we are now. So we've had better evidence that has definitely come along. And there's 2 particular studies that I'm going to point you to. And again, I'll do my best to put these links inside of the show notes. So modern data. So there's a review that was done through the National Institutes of Health, found that muscle mass had decreased by about 3 to 8% per decade after 30, but the decline becomes significantly faster after 60. So, as I kind of referenced at the beginning, the idea that muscle mass starts to decline, or just put in layman's terms, the idea that someone says you lose muscle after 40 is not wrong. They're not wrong at all. In fact, the research shows that muscle mass decreases after about the age of 30. But again, that's 3 to 8% per decade. All right. And then the research is now finding that the more significant decline happens after 40. So keep that in mind. 3 to 8% per decade after 30, but more of a significant decline after 60. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what I think is contributing to that. First, though, there was one other paper. It was titled An Overview of Sarcopenia. And that particular one showed that muscle strength declines around 1.5% per year between ages 50 and 60, jumping to about 3% per year after 60. So myself and others that are in the fitness industry who are now more referencing this, significant decline tends to happen more after the age of 60. This is the type of paper and research that we are more referencing when we go to that 60 number. So yes, you have measurable changes that are going to start in midlife, but the big drop off shows up later. So that steeper slope, I believe, happens mostly in people, and I'm going to talk about this very shortly now. I believe that happens mostly in people who tend to either stop or greatly reduce the either volume or intensity, I would say, the intensity and or frequency of their training, and tend to find themselves under eating specifically protein. All right. So just wanted to share that with you. So let's also then move into talking about lifestyle. And this is where I believe the biggest impact is on the increase in the speed of that muscle mass being lost. I believe a lot of that and most of it is impacted more by lifestyle than it is simply by chronology. So remember that your age is going to basically, let's say, set the stage, and then your lifestyle itself, the lifestyle choices that you make, those are the things that are going to really write the script for the movie that is about to happen. So let's talk about 4 primary areas that this is anecdotal. So based on my experience working with, again, people one-on-one, working with people in groups, having umpteen 50-11 conversations with people around these things, especially when I think in the age bracket of 40 plus, these are 4 things that I believe are the lifestyle factors that are affecting people significantly. One is strength training. So ensuring that folks are getting in minimum 2, I would say on the sweet spot, somewhere between 2 to 4 strength training sessions per week, I think is a big factor. I'm sharing with you here what I think are factors that, if they're missing, help contribute to this muscle mass declining at a certain age. And on the flip side, these are factors where if you keep them mostly consistent, you will likely, I believe, based on the evidence that I have working with folks, I believe that you would see that progression slow quite a bit. So one would be strength training 2 to 4 times a week. And I actually I say like 2 to 4, I would say 2 or more times per week with proper intensity. 2, I would say protein intake. So making sure that there's a steady intake spread throughout the day. Something that I reference is just what I call like this protein first mindset. So building your plate around, okay, where is my protein source coming from? And then fill it in around that. So, the easy example would be when you're going to a restaurant, is it a chicken dish? Is it a beef dish? Is it a salmon dish? Whatever it might be. And then building the plate around that versus more often than not, building it around, it's going to be this potato or it's going to be this pasta or whatever it might be. Don't get me wrong. Like, don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that you should never do those things. Note that I believe I said more often than not, like having that prioritization on protein and trying to build a plate around that more often than not, typically when done correctly, can really help ensuring that you're getting in a decent amount of protein. Third, daily movement. And this is outside of your training session. And Kelly and I have talked about this on the Lifting, Running, Living podcast. An active lifestyle is more than how many times you work out in a week. In fact, when I am talking to somebody about an active lifestyle, how many times they're training is really the last thing that I'm interested in as a personal trainer. The first thing I want to get an understanding for when we're talking about an active lifestyle is the things that you're doing outside of your training. Because it can be very, very common for folks who train to check the box of training 4, maybe even 5 days per week. And then when we talk about what are they doing outside of their training, it's not a whole lot. Very rarely going on walks, very rarely getting any sort of other physical activity in, whether it's going on hikes or going on bike rides or playing sports recreationally or playing different things with their kids, whatever the case may be, but just daily movement, getting in walks, just moving on a regular basis throughout the day, or in pockets, or what we call snacks throughout the day. And then last but certainly not least, because this is pretty much like the bedrock and the foundation of a lot of functions that we need, both mentally and physically, is sleep and recovery. So are we being intentional with those things? So, sometimes I will have folks who will say, yeah, I get, I definitely am good at recovery and whatnot. And what they're talking about is that they're good at laying on the couch. Like, yeah, I have no problem like laying on the couch until 1 o'clock in the morning. That's recovery, right? Not necessarily. So when we talk about sleep and recovery, what we're talking about is, what does your sleep wind down routine look like? Just simple and basic. What do things look like when you get up first thing in the morning? What sort of choices are you making to try and protect that hour before you're going to bed? Different things like that. So again, just to run through these 4 factors that I believe will either help or hinder this particular process of muscle loss as you go 60 and beyond: strength training, protein, movement, sleep, and recovery. Okay. And I can start wrapping this particular one up. So let's just really quickly run through a reminder here. The myth here, and I don't even know if I should necessarily say myth, but the common belief here is that at age 40, all of a sudden, muscle just starts to disappear and rapidly decline. And the reality is that gradual decline pretty much starts around, we'll say like midlife, and then the more significant decline, so at a faster rate, happens generally around age 60. And more often than not, that's typically happening in folks that are very sedentary, folks who do not have a very active lifestyle. And again, remember, when I'm saying active lifestyle, it's more than just how many times you are lifting weights or going for a run. It is your day to day. Okay, so do keep that in mind. So I want to remind you here, as we're closing out, it's not like all of a sudden, like I said, you hit a birthday and all of a sudden your muscles are like, hey fellas, like now it's time to go ahead and bring it on down a notch. Sorry, 10% of you have just got to go. Peace, be gone. Like, your muscle has no idea how old you are. They do know, however, your workload and what you've been consistent with. So quick takeaways for you: strength train 2 or more times per week. Try and get in somewhere around 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal. Have that protein first mindset. Focus on getting in daily movement, whether that's walking, hiking, playing a sport of some sort, whatever it might be. Try and get some movement in every day. And then sleep and recover intentionally. That's the key word: intentionally. All right. So with that, I just want to close things out and remind you, you are not, contrary to what your friends may say every time that they feel like something, a little ache, a little pain, a little whatever, they say, oh, this is just what happens when you get old. No, this is what happens when you're getting older and you are making decisions to be less active. That's what happens then. So again, if you are that person who says that, miss me with all that. And I've got to believe there's at least some other folks, especially if you've listened to this podcast regularly or you rock with me online or in real life. I've got to believe that there are some other folks who are in the same camp as I am, where whenever I have somebody who's like, yeah, I guess this is just what happens, I say no. Or they'll say, I guess this is just what happens. You know what I mean? I say, no, I don't know what you mean. And sometimes that'll spark a conversation, and sometimes it'll spark a dirty look, and I'm okay with either one of those most of the time. So I'm not worried about it. All right. So with that, we are going to bring today's episode to a close. If you've listened this long, I truly, truly appreciate you. So thank you again for listening to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Until next time, stay moving, stay active, and I'll talk to you later.